Welcome to the National Hispanic Cannabis Council Educational Committee Forum on Cannabis 101, where we bring medical professionals together to demystify the health and wellness power of cannabis and to help break down the Latino community's long-held cultural taboos and beliefs on cannabis. My name is David Sanchez, and board member of the National Hispanic Cannabis Council, as well as Cresco Labs' VP of Product Development. Today, we bring together two cannabis doctors and my partners from the NHCC's Board of Directors, Dr. Phil Burns and Dr. Craig Ontel from New York State of Mind, and my colleague, Dr. Chanel Law from Cresco Labs, to discuss today's topic, cannabis and anxiety. A little bit more about an introduction for me. I've been in the cannabis industry for 12 plus years. I got my start in Colorado and had the fortune of seeing adult use legalization hit the nation for the first time. Finishing my studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, I realized how much of a green field the industry was, and I decided to dive right in. My background is in chemistry and specifically on cannabis manufacturing. Over the last 10 years, I've helped set up multiple labs, build up extraction teams, and get manufactured cannabis products to the market. Joining me today is Dr. Craig Ontel, who trained at NYU's Rusk Institute of Rehabilitation. From there, Dr. Ontel has spent nearly 15 years of private practice in NYC, where he also served as the director at the Ambulatory Orthopedic Rehabilitation at NYU's Langone's hospital system. In May of 2021, he left NYU to become CEO for State of Mind Cannabis. Dr. Ontel has personally treated hundreds of medical cannabis patients over the past few years and has had significant success in weaning patients off of narcotic-based medicines and substituting with non-euphoric, non-sedating, cannabis-based options. Dr. Ontel has been published in numerous cannabis articles and has presented at national conferences. Second up on our guest list today, Dr. Phil Burns, Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine. Dr. Burns has been practicing medicine for over 20 years, completing specialty training in the field of physical medicine and rehabilitation at NYU Langone's Health Rusk Institute of Rehabilitation Medicine. Upon completing that training, he founded and has operated a successful medical practice specializing in orthopedic rehabilitation and prosthetics. Dr. Burns is driven by his desire to make a meaningful impact in the state opioids crisis. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Chanel Law, our senior scientist at Cresco Labs, bringing 10 plus years of research in chemistry, macromolecular science, nanomedicine, and working in a couple of different labs spanning chemistry, biochemistry, pathology, engineering, and medicine. Dr. Law now serves as a committee member of the Academic Clinical Research Committee, oversees research on differing routes of administration, new medical conditions, symptomatic treatment in vivo and in vitro, as well as clinical trials with medical marijuana. Dr. Law is a PhD in chemistry from the University of British Columbia, where she developed novel compounds designed to target valuable blood components and documented their translational applications in peer-reviewed publications, as well as patents. She has multidisciplinary experience ranging from the Center of Blood Research in Vancouver to the University of Michigan's Medical School. Since joining Cresco, Dr. Law has applied her scientific research expertise to medical cannabis research, leading the team in the development of novel cannabis formulations, methods for chemico-physical characterization, data-driven drug stability, and supporting the organization's goals of professionalizing the cannabis industry. Welcome, Dr. Law, and welcome, Dr. Phil and Dr. Burns.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. For today's NHCC's Educational Committee Roundtable on Cannabis 101, the intent for this session is to provide an informative overview on cannabis and anxiety. Before we get started, I first wanted to say a few words about the National Hispanic Cannabis Council and its mission, which is to educate the U.S. Hispanic community on the health, wellness, and economic aspects of cannabis to empower their support and participation in the industry. It is also to help demystify through educational programs, such as this one, for the health and wellness power of cannabis, and to help break down those long-held cultural taboos and beliefs on cannabis. So without further ado, guys, let's get started. How do we kick this off? Guys, big question of the day, cannabis and anxiety. Doctors, is this a good combination?
The long and the short answer is the same, and it's yes. However, when we step into cannabis and anxiety, at the highest level, we have to look at THC and CBD. And we all know there's a lot of other breakdown products besides the CBD. THC in and of itself is anxiogenic. So THC can promote anxiety, while CBD is anxiolytic, meaning it helps to get rid of anxiety. So we have two competing compounds in the same substance that we're ingesting. So it's really figuring out the right amount of THC and or CBD and the breakdown products to find that sweet spot.
Okay, and so do all anxiety designations qualify to use cannabis, or what are the major ones that qualify to use cannabis with anxiety?
So that's a great question. And we've mentioned this when we spoke about sleep and we spoke about depression and some of the other conversations that we had. And it really comes down to, you have to know what you're starting with. And what type of anxiety are we dealing with? And why does this individual have anxiety? Is it acute? Is it long-term? Depending upon what you read, there's a handful of major anxiety episodes. You have your general anxiety disorder, you have your panic disorder, you have your social anxiety, you have your phobias, fear of crowded spaces, and then you also have your PTSD. So it really depends upon what you're starting with and how long-term it's been. A lot of the literature out there shows a significant variability of benefit based upon the underlying cause.
That's interesting, and I was not aware that PTSD was a form of anxiety. We've had conversations about PTSD before and the benefits and the efficacy of cannabis and PTSD, but interesting to hear that it's under the anxiety umbrella.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, because this is something we discussed before, where we came to an agreement on a panel just like this, that a higher dose THC product does wonders for someone with PTSD, because it affects the sleep cycle and kind of decreases the memories and the dreams and all of that. So your PTSD people do great. However, when we're looking at just a pure anxiety, very frequently that high THC creates more anxiety. So once again, it's a very difficult balance. And it goes back to a phrase that I kept seeing time and time again when I was researching this to become deep on the subject. And that was, anxiety is a personal experience. And that really rang true to me and reinforces the different subsets.
Yeah. So with that, anxiety is something that's very prevalent in society. Probably about 20% of the population is going to experience anxiety throughout the course of a year. The mainstays of treatment are 40 to 60% effective. So looking towards cannabis and alternatives is something that is definitely prudent, right? And like Dr. Antel was saying, anxiety can be many different things to many different people. So the broadness of the diagnosis lends itself well to obviously different types of treatments coming together, right? But anxiety is essentially, a manifestation or an outshoot of the normal sort of fight or flight response, which is very specific to a specific stimuli. But in anxiety, it becomes very disorganized and unregulated and lasts for, a much longer time, and then starts impacting someone's, quality of life, their normal daily activities, and just general fulfillment. So appreciating the cause of their anxiety, but also how it's manifesting in them goes a long way to being more specific with the overall treatment plan, and therefore a higher degree of success or anticipated success with that treatment.
Interesting.
Yeah. I like that. I like this a lot, actually. I like what you said about anxiety being a bit more of a personal experience, because that lends itself a lot to what we're seeing in the literature, which is that, in many self-reports across New Zealand, Australia, different states in the US, we're seeing that patients are reporting that they are commonly taking medical marijuana to treat their anxiety. And they are we're seeing reports of more than 70% of certain populations where people are saying they are feeling an anti-anxiety effect from the marijuana that they're inhaling.
Absolutely. And,
yeah.
we read the same studies, which is why I smiled, because I was reading the New Zealand one as well. And yeah, I mean, the numbers, the feedback that we get, and I'll say it anecdotally, because a lot of these are from, Star Print and Relief, where it's that feedback directly from the patient or the consumer. But everything out there shows at least 50% of patients are using cannabis for anxiety, and they have substituted out their prescribed medication, open close quotes, from their physician, and replaced it with cannabis. And they're feeling great and doing great on it. So yes, absolutely. The data's out there. It is.
Yes, I love that we've read the same studies. I was going to highlight one more, which was actually one of our Cresco ACRC partnered studies in Pennsylvania, where actually 95% of our participants denied experiencing adverse effects from using their medical cannabis. More than 50% of them used it to treat their anxiety. And what we're thinking, our hypothesis is it's possible it's because Pennsylvania uses a pharmacist model where patients have the opportunity at each of the medical marijuana dispensaries to interact with a certified pharmacist, and that might help them in their titration and kind of limit the risk of overconsumption.
Absolutely. And that's one of the most important things that we're dealing with here as healthcare providers. And I know it's something that's coming up in a question down the road, but we'll really get to it. And with anxiety and with THC and cannabis, it's all about the dosing. It's all about the dosing. And cannabis is biphasic. And it's a word that I'm going to throw out here now, and it's going to come back again and again and again throughout this conversation. But at its most simplistic form, in order for me to explain biphasic, is I'll speak about alcohol, something that most folks that are watching this podcast have had some experience with. And if you have a cocktail, you may feel a little bit relaxed and you feel good. If you have too many cocktails, you start to go into respiratory depression and you run into a lot of other issues. So with cannabis, and especially with anxiety and THC specifically, very important to start our native user, someone who's not THC sensitive or who's used it before, at a very, very, very low dose, or they're going to have too much THC, they're going to have an anxiety event and they're going to be much worse off. And Chanel, you said something also it's for Dr. Burns and I, it's the biggest thing we deal with, and that's side effects. And very frequently when we write a prescription, we spend time always discussing the side effect profile. And the patient comes back in and frequently they're not using the medication anymore because they can't tolerate the side effects. much like you said, with 95+%, we're not seeing that in cannabis. We're just not.
That's
So
incredible.
the patients follow through, their retention is much higher.
Incredible. And I wanted to focus on something that that you mentioned, which is like the specific dose is very important. And so maybe this question is two parts. The first question is, how does the diagnosis of anxiety start and where does that end? And then the follow-up question is, because the dose is so important and because it's biphasic and we have competing compounds with competing properties, how do you guys go about, one, diagnosing, and two, then saying, here's what we believe to be the best dose and the best mix of active ingredients? What's that process like?
The diagnosing is key. And that's the difference between being a good healthcare provider and not. That's just a fact. It's really what it is. And it all comes down to the history and listening to the patient, which folks don't do. And there's a saying, garbage in, garbage out. That's for everything. Medicine, computers, it doesn't matter. So if, as physicians, if we have the wrong diagnosis up front, we have the wrong treatment plan. And anxiety is tough because remember, it's a personal experience.
Yeah.
So you really have to peel the layers and see why that patient has anxiety. I won't get into it on this one, but for folks that want to look back at our prior talk on sleep, a big portion of how we manage sleep was based upon the underlying diagnosis and making sure they didn't have a major depressive episode at the same time when we were prescribing cannabis. So it's really following our clinical guidelines to make a diagnosis, then making sure that patient is in that right stratification, whether they have a panic disorder or a generalized anxiety type disorder. So once we get to that, then if the person's a frequent user of cannabis, we're a little bit more lax with dosing. But if you're coming to this native and you're brand new to it, we like to not go any higher than 5 milligrams of THC to start, and maybe even less, with a nice amount of CBD. And I'm talking pretty much at a ratio of 10-to-1 or 13-to-1 of CBD to THC. Because the other thing that CBD does is it negates that cognitive effect of the THC. So we're not looking for someone that's never had a cannabis product to take something and get very anxious. That isn't going to help us at all.
Yeah.
So I hate to say go slow and ramp up because it's kind of a cop out for us, but that's how we really have to approach this.
Perfect. And is there any literature available helping to give guidance on the dosing? And I know we've talked a lot about CBD and THC, but there's a lot of additional cannabinoids coming into literature. And what do those doses tell us? And what are those active ingredients? Are those also helpful for anxiety?
Yeah, in cannabis, this is the year of the terpene. That's what I like to say. And anyone who's in cannabis will smile at that statement. So yeah, there are so many different variables that we have here. And we know that certain terpenes like mycerin and limonene work really good with anxiety and others don't. We're at a big disadvantage here as physicians and clinicians and scientists in that there has not been a ton of real deep dedicated research done on this. And a lot of the data that we rely upon is not data that as physicians, a big pharmaceutical company would be pushing forward. A lot of it is patient feedback data. And the biggest limitation that we have as I sit here today is we don't have a lot of specifics on the actual cannabis product the patient is taking. For example, let's just throw a number out there, which will be wrong. let's say there's 1,000 different cannabis strains out there that are available. They all have a different percentage of terpenes in them. They all have a different percentage of THC, et cetera. So for us to generalize something and say that hypothetically an indica product is better for anxiety than a sativa, we're doing ourselves a disservice. As our colleagues like Chanel, who's sitting here, continues to get a lot more granular with that, and we're able to really map specific strains and terpene profiles, the science that we're working on will exponentially become more important.
Mhm. Yeah, I'd agree
Yeah,
with
and,
that.
and we
In terms of the
I was just
the area of the brain that controls these emotions, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the cerebral cortex, all have a high amount of CB1 receptors, and the cannabinoids are well suited to go and affect change in someone with anxiety disorder because of the presence of these receptors in these specific brain areas. And the ratios of the many different cannabinoids is something that, like Dr. Antel was saying, needs to be further studied so we could be more specific with ratios and which cannabinoids are most effective. Throw the terpene profile on top of that, and we're onto something.
Yeah, and in some of our previous talks, we've talked about some of these challenges with the research, with the inconsistency of materials available, and I think this leads to some good questions for Dr. Law here. And what are some of the current challenges with medical cannabis research, and what are some of those obstacles that you're seeing, Chanel?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. So, as we all know, there are a number of challenges, particularly in the legislature. So for a lot of our academic partners who, have the big labs, the very, very strong researchers, they're actually unable to bring our product onto their campus and work with the product. Fortunately, one way that we can proceed with this research is we are able to take the results from all of our in-house testing. So as you know, we test all of our products at Cresco for their terpene profiles, their potency, which includes all of the minor cannabinoids in that matrix. And we are able to work with our partners, our academic partners, and they can kind of reverse engineer. They can buy the specific terpenes and formulate it to make it back to what we were hoping they would have been able to work with. And from there, they're able to do a number of in vitro and in vivo studies. However, with the clinical side of the studies, we've actually been having a lot of conversations lately, which has been kind of funny, where a lot of the researchers, they're not able to give any of their participants medical marijuana. And particularly, they're not able to give it to them at the university where they have their sleep clinics, where they have their blood labs. And so there's been some talk about potentially having another offsite place where the patients may be able to take the medical marijuana and then go into the clinic. Although we have to deny knowing that there's any sort of medical marijuana. And there are some loopholes we've been trying to find, because then we're like, well, the blood has cannabis in it. Is that legal? And so those are just some of the hurdles that we have to go through. But the good news is that we're all progressing forward. We're all making very big strides in research throughout the basic translational and clinical studies. So we'll get there one day.
Indeed.
And for our listeners, how can patients know if cannabis is good for them and their anxiety disorder? How will folks know if they're struggling with something and maybe they don't know if it's anxiety and might be curious? How would you get them started on that journey of saying, like, hey, do I have anxiety? Is this something that's kind of affecting me? And is cannabis a good solution?
I'm going to step off of cannabis for a second with this one, just because, mental health is a big issue in this country, period. I'm sitting here in Manhattan, I'm in LA all the time. There's no shortage of mental health services that need to be doled out there. So, this comes up in every talk. It's always about something. How do we know if it's right or wrong? And what Dr. Burns always likes to say is, don't do anything without asking your physician first. And yeah, that's absolutely right. And I said before, garbage in, garbage out. Folks shouldn't try to self-diagnose. They really shouldn't try to self-medicate. They are with cannabis. Chanel said it before, 71% of folks are just taking it. And, we look at the literature, we look at all the surveys in adult use and medical dispensaries, greater than 50% of the people walking in there are for medicine, even on the recreational side. So it's really making sure you have that right diagnosis up front, and then it's a lot easier to treat the problem. Another thing is also taking into account the cultural barriers that we have here and how we can really address those and get past those. And that's something that we should not negate here or minimize. And the social stigma to anxiety in certain cultural classes is very strong. And there's often a shame component about it. And it's hard for folks to look for help. And depending upon the community that we're speaking about, each community feels comfortable in a different setting going for healthcare advice. Yeah. So in the Hispanic community, it might be more family-based. In the Black community, it's more church-based. So it's really identifying where that medical information is going to come from as well. And it's, we never forget here, but I'll throw it out to everyone who's watching this for the first time. That cannabis that folks smoked in the 70s during Woodstock was, I'll give you a number, folks, on the average 212% less potent in THC than what we have today.
Alarming.
Mm-hmm.
Just a little bit of a caveat. And when we speak about someone starting cannabis today for anxiety, they need to be very careful with what they're taking. There are a handful of strains out there that have been very popular in the anxiety realm. One of them is ACDC, which is, more of a one-to-one. Yep. Critical Cure, I'm just mentioning some. Granddaddy Purple, Harley Sue, Northern Lights. So there's been a few out there that have been a go-to. And the reason being is they're really not overly concentrated in THC. Another thing for folks out there, and I'm sorry, I'm rambling on with this because I was talking THC, is, there's a lot of misinformation about it, and not everyone is watching this podcast for the anxiety reason. So I'll throw out that educational component here, this tidbit. The higher the THC, it's at the expense of the terpene profile, everybody. So a lot of that benefit that you're getting from the plant, you're going to lose in a very high THC. So if you're watching this and it's for medical reasons, as I hope it is, don't forget that when you sit and you speak with the pharmacist or the physician that's writing the prescription.
Mm-hmm.
Those are true golden nuggets that you're dropping there, and couldn't agree more. And so, as you mentioned, these ACDC, Charlotte Webb's, Harley Sue, Harley Quinn kind of strains, how do these cannabis products differ from other remedies or drugs for anxiety that are currently available in the marketplace?
Well, other medications or other treatments, sort of the mainstay is psychotherapy, right? Identifying the cause and progressively working through that trigger to de-escalate and develop sort of adaptive techniques. That takes time though, and it takes work, right? Benzodiazepines are used extensively. They work very quickly. They could be sedative and they could be addictive. So, you're risking dependency as well. The different SSRIs and SNRIs, the antidepressives, also have a long history of treatment, or utilization in the treatment of anxiety disorders. But they could take weeks to reach effect. Also, beta blockers, they're particularly useful with sort of social anxiety, stage fright, etc. They have their own risk profile, or I guess profile of side effects that patients may not like to utilize that treatment. So, and then there's also other techniques, breathing exercises, exercise, mindfulness training, etc. But in the totality of these medications we listed, I think there is definitely a strong place for the use of a cannabis product when prescribed by their physician and discussed with the pharmacist, in that we can directly target without the high THC product that's not going to give them any sort of cognitive deficit. Our goal is to re-engage people and into their normal quality of life. And so over medicating with some of these benzodiazepines, et cetera, probably not the best choice. So again, cannabis, I think, has a definite role in this. Again, correctly prescribed and progressively increased to realize the desired effect without the potential side effects that we are looking to avoid.
Yeah, and Dr. Burns, I did want to follow up. You did mention a couple of words that stuck with me, and I want to make sure that our viewers get some of the questions that I anticipate them having. I heard words like risk, I heard words like addiction, and I heard words like you have to wait a while of dosing before the medication starts to have effect. And so the question is there risk with long-term users of traditional medication as well as cannabis?
Yes. So the benzodiazepines, that's the Valiums, the Xanax, et cetera. But then also Ativan, Klonopin, they all could be very sedative. And again, if we're trying to reintegrate people into, sort of a higher quality of life and getting them back to their normal daily activities where anxiety has inhibited that, giving them something that is that can potentially be overly sedative doesn't allow for that desired effect to be completely fulfilled. And then again, the antidepressants that have been traditionally used, they take time for them to work. So if someone has, significant panic disorders, to wait weeks for the SSRI to work might not be the best option. Oftentimes, a combination of therapy can be effective too in starting someone on a more fast-acting, effective medication, and then weaning them off to a longer term is used. But with the cannabis product, we could start them and maintain them on the same product over time.
And what's
we
the
also
ramp?
have with David, we also have with cannabis, and much like what Dr. Burns was saying, cannabis is going after those same neurotransmitters in the brain that the prescription-based medications that we prescribe are. The prescription-based medications have a lovely side effect profile. Usually, anyone who reads the side effects on the label can go for days, on and on and on. We tend to not see that really with cannabis. So it tends to be a much easier lift. Dr. Burns brought up something very important, which I just want to emphasize a little bit. And you asked a question. It's about long-term risk. And what are we thinking about here long-term? So Dr. Burns mentioned the benzodiazepines. That's your Valiums, your Xanax. Folks have heard about those before. Problem with those is they break down to an inactive metabolite. So for the non-science folks, that means that product breaks down into something that our body has a hard time getting rid of. And over time, especially in the elderly folks, they become toxic on this, and they become confused and they become disoriented. We're not seeing that really with cannabis. With the cannabis, if we have a bad effect, it's out of our system fairly quick. And we don't have to wean folks off it, and we tend to not have to ramp them up it. So for us, for a cause and effect relationship, it's a lot easier for us to work with a cannabis-based product. And we have much less concern, there's always a concern, but less of a concern with medication interaction of other things that people are taking. So as far as a lift goes, which is a terminology we use here in medicine, it's a lot lighter lift for us to manage the anxiety from a cannabis perspective.
So interesting. And are those inactive metabolites associated with the constipation that folks get and kind of not being able to digest some of those compounds in their body?
No, it's really more of in your elderly population, a confusion where they're just not able to clear it out of their system anymore. You know, their renal function, their liver function, everything as you age decreases. So eventually grandpa starts to get really confused out of nowhere. And if they're on long-term benzodiazepine use, it's frequently from that, or it could be from that.
Yeah,
So
and I did have a follow-up question, because I think a lot of folks probably viewing this know that cannabis stays in your system for quote unquote long periods of time, but I'm hearing you say that that's not necessarily the case.
Staying in your system and being psychogenically or psychologically active are two different things. So, you know, I can take a Tylenol or something, and I'm sure someone can, you know, do a blood test in a handful of days and still see part of that ingredient, you know, or part of the Tylenol if they looked for it. So cannabis you can test positive for, depending upon how much you use, how you take it, and your body habitus, because it remains in the fat cells. For a heavy user, it could sit there for upwards of 30 days. But they're not getting any cognitive effect or anything. Once, you know, typically with smoking, for example, after a handful of hours or so, that effect's gone for the most part. So yes, it tests positive in their system, but they're not experiencing anything from it anymore.
Agreed.
Well, thank you for that.
The last thing I was going to add about the testing positive is commonly a lot of the testing labs are testing for cannabis metabolites. So it's not necessarily the active Delta-9 that's still in circulation in your blood for the weeks or however long it's quoted to stay in your system. And there's a bit of debate out there as to which metabolites we should be testing for and which ones might actually indicate some sort of lingering of effects in your system. So I'm really glad we brought that up.
Yeah, and this is one of those cultural taboos that I think folks are misinformed about, right? I think a lot of folks are like, oh, I don't touch it because it stays in your system so long, and I don't want to deal with that or have that in my body for so long, etc. But I think there's a good demystification happening here.
There is. And another thing, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation, is people need to not be embarrassed or ashamed to tell their doctor they use cannabis. This isn't 20, 30 years ago. We're not putting a red star. It's not like Seinfeld, write something in Elaine's chart. Got it? Like, no, we're good. Like, we're doctors. We get it. And to be frank, we would rather you tell us that than hear that you're, taking something else from somewhere else. So you got to let us know and share it. And there's no shame to it. That's passe, that's gone. It's, when we record it in our record, guys, it's not drug use anymore. It's social. Got it? So share with us. Let us know. We'll be able to help you.
That's a pro tip right there. Thank you, Dr. Phil. And so what else can we tell the viewers who are curious about possibly starting cannabis and seeing if it's a good fit for anxiety? What else can we tell the viewers, or might there be some misconceptions on getting this process started?
The most important thing that I tell folks is don't listen to your friends. All right. Don't listen to your Aunt Sally, what she uses. I said it before, anxiety is personal experience, and each one of us are different. We have a different physiology. We take different medications. Everything we put in our body interacts differently. So, because one thing works for someone else, don't think that's the right way to go. Speak to the pharmacist, speak to the physician, get that real data, get that face to face, and let someone help you move along the right path here. As I mentioned before, there's so much variability. Even if you read the studies that we read here, don't forget, we have no idea what type of cannabis they're referencing here. So there's a lot of variabilities. Your best source of information is that in-house pharmacist sitting there, or that physician who's actually writing you the prescription. And as a doctor, if you see the doc for the prescription and it's a $99, here you go, have a nice day, see a different doctor. Got it? You guys are using this and you're watching this here as a medicine. So treat it as such and take it seriously up front. There's a lot of expert healthcare providers out there that will do the right thing. There's just as many out there that won't. So treat this as you would anything else.
I couldn't agree more. That was incredibly well said. Going back to what you said earlier about how unique cannabis is and all of the different strains out there, I think that would be the main thing I hope viewers remember is if you try it once and you've, taken something your friend has given you that worked really well for them and it didn't work for you, that doesn't necessarily mean that cannabis isn't going to work for you. There's so much out there, and particularly for anxiety, I do believe that, using CBD as well as THC can really help balance out the effects of THC. And you don't necessarily have to have euphoric effects to attain the symptom control for your anxiety, if that's what you're looking for. So I would highly recommend everything you said, consulting with your physician, your pharmacist, and give it a chance, a slow titrating chance.
Yeah. And I want to add to that, and you're dead on correct. When someone sees Dr. Burns or myself, and let's say we're going to write something for depression or anxiety, it very frequently doesn't work the first prescription we write. It just doesn't. And it might have worked for a lot. And that's why there's 100 different antidepressant medicines or anxiety medicines, because not each works for an individual. So whether it's cannabis or prescription-based stuff, you're not always going to knock it out of the park with the first one. So don't give up. Keep looking, because you will find what you look for in life. You will.
And do you guys have any interesting case studies or success stories that you could share where someone found efficacy in cannabis and anxiety? Obviously, we don't have to disclose their name, but
it's, Phil is smiling and I'm smiling, and we brought this up before. I have probably about 1,000 cannabis patients in New York. We only have maybe 100,000 in the whole state. So I've had a lot of personal cannabis experience from all walks of life. And can I sit here and specifically mention someone? And I have before in other talks we've had. No. But can I tell you overall that when patients come back in and I look at their medications, are they on less anxiolytics? Absolutely. Are they on less antidepressants? Absolutely. Are they on less pain medicine? Absolutely. So where I don't have a specific person to mention, what I do have is patient records, medication use, and we see every day the substitution. And everything out there shows, everything, that in states that roll out a medical program, you have less use of these types of medications. You just do.
Wow, that's profound. And what about the states that don't have anxiety as a medical qualification that qualifies you in a medical state to get a marijuana prescription? What would you say to those states, and how anxiety should be a part of that qualification list, shouldn't be? What kind of comments would we have there?
You know, when the data out there shows us that, you know, half of the folks that are showing up at a dispensary, medical or rec, are there for anxiety, I think that speaks volumes. And, you know, the world is consumer and patient driven. They're asking for it. So they're showing up, they're looking for it. And we're, the states that aren't covering it are doing those patients a disservice, because they're forcing them to go on their own.
Yeah.
So instead of giving them that medical expertise that's available from providers, they're saying no, and that's much more dangerous than anything else. So we're seeing, like I said before, talk to your doctor, we're seeing this transition occurring across the country, even across the globe right now.
Yeah.
Europe, everywhere. I mean, this is becoming more and more acceptable. It's the endocannabinoid system. We're no longer closing our eyes to it. It's become forefront in conversation. So we'll, much like Chanel said before,
Yes.
we'll get there. We will.
Yeah.
And Dr.
Yeah.
Burns said.
Of the to Dr. Antel's point, of the patients that are self-medicating with cannabis, the number one diagnosis is pain. The number two diagnosis is anxiety. So up to half the amount of people that are self-medicating or self-described as being self-medicated, anxiety is the diagnosis they're attempting to treat. In several states that don't have a specific delineation for anxiety, they do have sort of a carve out that the physician, if he could validate the use through, you know, studies, etc., that cannabis is effective, they can write it. So this goes to Dr. Chanel to go and publish more studies. So.
Yeah, there's always a back, you know, I don't want to say there's always a back door, but if the physician takes their time and they take that history and they identify why they have that anxiety, if there's another component that's causing it that qualifies, then they're good to go. I also want to just, you know, repeat one thing I said before, which I think is paramount to the question you asked. Half of the folks in these studies, and these are multi-thousand person studies, and there was about 10 of them, they've stopped their prescription anti-anxiety medicine.
Wow.
And they're just on cannabis. And they wouldn't do that if they didn't feel better.
Sure. Yeah.
Fact. So that's
so interesting. And you know, and I think the reason I ask is because I feel in speaking with some regulators or you know, folks that are kind of organizing the medical programs in some states that do not allow for chronic pain and anxiety disorders, have this conception of, well, if we add chronic pain and anxiety, then you might as well go adult use, right? A lot of folks, I think, attribute that to like, well, if you put those qualifying conditions, anybody can get a script and it'll go to like the California model where you can fly in, you know, go to the boardwalk, get a medical marijuana prescription because, oh, my back hurts. And then boom, now you're able to go into a dispensary, right? How can folks like Chanel help create robust arguments to say like, hey, these are real things that are happening. And to your point, folks are clamoring for these types of ailments to qualify. But for some reason, the states don't want to adopt that.
I think a lot of it has to do with just, I don't think I know. A lot of it has to do with just a pure lack of understanding of cannabis. And I've been at this for a while, and I've spoke with lots of assemblymen and regulators and folks that write rules and laws. And I mean, I spent, the first 6 months doing this, educating folks that you don't necessarily get high if you smoke.
Yeah.
And explaining to people that you can use a low THC and a higher CBD based product to address a lot of these ailments, and the folks don't get any cognitive effect, and they're okay to drive. And the looks of shock and awe that I got, it was the first time people were hearing this. So for people like Chanel, it all comes down to education. And unless folks are educated, they're never going to make the right decision. And they're going to go based upon their beliefs that they've had for however long. We all know here the reality is anyone who's looking for marijuana gets marijuana, period. I mean, Mike Bloomberg just said the other day, it's easier to buy an ounce of weed in Manhattan than a slice of pizza. And he wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't. So that argument to me really doesn't hold much merit, because folks will get what they want. This is not decades ago.
Yeah.
So it's really the moving it more to the Department of Health and getting physicians more involved and researchers more involved, and maybe moving these decisions away from politicians and lawmakers who today are talking about cannabis, but last week we're talking about legalizing gambling, and next week we're talking about something else. Yeah. And I'm a firm believer that someone who's an expert in something should stick with it, and a jack of all trades is a master of none.
That's true.
So it comes down to that. And once we're able to get through that, and that's an awfully big lift, once we get that done, we'll be in a better place.
I love it. I have one last study to share with everyone, which I found to be very interesting. There was a study published by Anderson et al. In 2014, which showed that there was a very strong negative relationship between the legalization of medical marijuana and suicide rates among young men. Granted, it's not necessarily causal. This was a mathematical model that they applied to the statistics they had across all of the states at the time that had legalized medical marijuana. But I found that to be very interesting, especially for our conversation today on cannabis and anxiety. So just wanted to share that.
Yeah.
And it's almost like tune in next time for next week's agenda, cannabis and suicide. That might be a topic of conversation that we haven't really dove into at all, I think.
We touched it with the PTSD when we hit that recently, and we'll certainly dive real deep into that one here. But absolutely, yeah, it's prevalent.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, all of our viewers and watchers, for tuning in to our conversation this week, talking about cannabis and anxiety. I'd like to thank Dr. Law, Dr. Burns, Dr. Phil. You guys' insights on the matter are more than appreciated. I think our viewers will definitely hit that like and subscribe button and appreciate you guys' time. This has been very helpful. And I think we really got to the bottom of some mysteries and some taboos that folks think, such as, is cannabis going to stay in my system for so long, and what are those impacts, right? So thank you, everyone, and thank you guys for being a guest on today's show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
All right.
Have a great day, everyone.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.